What's up, everybody? Thanks for checking into the YouTube channel. My name is Matthew, pastor of Gospel Fellowship PCA. We're a Reformed Bible-believing church just north of Pittsburgh. If you're looking for a church like that, come visit us. Now, a couple of weeks ago, I did a video where I compared our worship service at Gospel Fellowship. We're Reformed and Presbyterian, as I just said, to a friend of mine, Jeffrey Rice, who's a 1689 Reformed Baptist. And we lined up our worship services and we did kind of a compare and contrast. Nothing spicy, nothing confrontational, just looking at how we did worship and comparing what we have similar and what we have different. Some of you let me know in the comments of that video that you thought it was very interesting and you're very interested in liturgy, that is the structure of worship in corporate worship on the Lord's Day. And so what I thought I'd do is go for an even deeper dive today and look at some of the worship services as they existed in the 1500s itself. Now, namely, we're going to look at the worship service of Martin Luther and that of John Calvin and that of John Knox, Mr. Scottish Presbyterian himself. With that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here, and we're going to look first of all at what Martin Luther did in his time. Now, I should tell you that Luther, on that cutting edge of one of the first reformers, of course, Zwingli's in that camp too, and there's some others as well, like Tyndale and Wycliffe and other such guys, but Luther being on the cutting edge, he was also one of the leaders in reforming corporate worship from what he had inherited from the medieval institutional church, that is to say, the Roman Catholic Church. Now, not everything that they did was bad or wrong. There was a lot of things that they did that were worthy of being imported into Protestant or a more biblical form of worship. And Luther really wanted to retain everything that he possibly could from what was called the medieval Mass, while jettisoning those things that he thought were no longer appropriate. Of course, he wanted to restore the church to a more biblical form. And so while he kept some things from medieval worship, he also felt free to reorder, restructure, or jettison other things. Luther's main idea here is that churches should have some freedom in worship. He did not want to prescribe a new law for what every church had to do, because he recognized that churches are a little bit different. I mean, for one thing, Luther had a couple of different services for those who had professional choirs, like a university church might have, as he had in Wittenberg. But he also wanted a liturgical form that would work for rural churches that were trying to also reform their doctrine and their worship. And so he actually had a couple of different proposals. One he called the German Mass, and another was a little bit more of a high church, music-oriented worship service. And so his main thing, again, we could jettison anything but the word. He wanted both law and gospel to come through in the worship service, and he wanted it to be something that was truly celebratory, which is why Luther's worship services have a lot of congregational singing. I'm going to show you their worship order here in just a moment. But I want to mention too that one of the things that Luther did very well from our perspective is to return the Lord's Supper or the Eucharist or communion to the laity in both kinds. That is to say, both bread and the cup. No longer like the medieval institutional church would only the priestly class be able to participate in both of the elements of the Lord's Supper, but Luther wanted the people to have it as well. So let's go ahead and look here at a Lutheran order of worship. And this would be his 1526 order, beginning with a psalm or a hymn here. So there's a lot of singing. At the beginning, they would also sing the Kyrie, which, if you're not familiar with that, probably you should be. It comes out of the Bible. It's that Lord have mercy, Christ have mercy, Lord have mercy prayer that we hear in the Gospels a couple of times. And then there would be another moment of robust German singing. As you know, Luther was a hymn writer himself. We think of course, his A Mighty Fortress is Our God, but other songs that he wrote too. And then there would be reading of the gospel and, again, the singing of the Nicene Creed. Now, some of your churches probably say one or more of the creeds, but do you sing the Nicene Creed? Luther did that. And then after that, there would be, of course, the sermon where the preacher would really preach. And Luther really wanted to express that the main portions of the gospel itself were to be exposited to the people from the pulpit, followed by the Lord's Prayer. And then, as you're going to see in these liturgies here, I have them sort of blocked off with this red, indicating this is where they would introduce the Lord's Supper in the service. And for Luther, there was an exhortation followed by the words of institution, almost invariably from one of the Gospels or from 1 Corinthians chapter 11. And then there would be the elevation and the distribution. And again, once more, there would be singing of the people as this was going on, followed in conclusion with a hymn and then a collect and then the benediction. Now, again, if you don't know what a collect is, it's sort of a set prayer very often that follows something of the liturgical calendar from the church year. So your Easter and your Christmas and your Advent and your Epiphany and things like that would be incorporated into Lutheran worship. Now, I don't know this firsthand. Obviously, I didn't have a time machine, nor do I have a bulletin left over that somebody left at the Wittenberg Church. But we get this information from this great book right here, Reformation Worship, Liturgies from the Past for the Present by Gibson and Ernge. I'm going to put a link to this book in the description of this video. They did excellent work going back through the first sources, the original sources, to help us by highlighting the orders and structures of worship, not only for Luther and Calvin and Knox, but also Zwingli and lots of others. Butzer and Bullinger and others are all in the book. It's a great book. So great job, Gibson and Ernge, on this particular book. Again, link in the description of this video. Even my graphics are gently lifted from that book as they put their nice little charts. Okay, so let's move on then to John Calvin. Now, Calvin had a couple of different liturgies, of course. He was in Geneva with Farel, and then they were exiled to Strasbourg for a bit, and then they're re-invited back to Geneva. So if you look at the book that I mentioned, Reformation Worship, you're going to notice that Calvin has a couple of different liturgies and orders of structured worship as well. A couple of things of note jump right off the bat. First of all, Calvin's debate with the Genevan Town Council about how often to have the Lord's Supper. Calvin wanted to do what Luther was doing, which is having the Lord's Supper every Sunday. But unfortunately, the Genevan Council pushed back on that, and they said, no, we're going to do it irregularly, namely quarterly or monthly. And so if you celebrate the Lord's Supper monthly or quarterly, you've probably inherited that tradition from John Calvin in Geneva. Now, of course, the scriptures don't say how often we're supposed to have the Lord's Supper, whether it's every week, every month, every year, or quarterly, whatever. Nevertheless, many of us have inherited that, and that's left over from Geneva in the time of John Calvin. I should also mention, too, that one of the unique features of Calvin's worship is the use of the singing of psalms. Calvin had commissioned a French singing psalter for the people. And of course, worship in the vernacular language is a hallmark of Reformation worship. That's one of the things that distinguished the Protestant church from the medieval institutional Roman Catholic Church, is vernacular languages. So Calvin and his congregation would sing the French Psalter. Now, for some of my exclusive psalmody friends, I'm going to disappoint you here a little bit, they also sang other things. They also sang the Decalogue and the Nunc Dimittis from the Gospel of Luke. If you don't know what that is, give it a Google. And of course, Calvin is known for his expository preaching style. In fact, so famous that when Calvin was exiled from Geneva, he goes over to Strasbourg, then he's recalled back to Geneva. He even returned to the very same text that he left off the previous time he was in Geneva. So we're going to see that too. One other interesting feature about Calvin is that every worship service began with a scripture called the Votum, or Psalm 124, verse 8. He seems to have always used that as a call to worship in his worship services. So let's look at Calvin's liturgy here. This is mostly drawn from 1542. Beginning with the Votum, or the Psalm, moving into an exhortation to worship, confession and forgiveness of sins coming early on in the worship service. Now, when I look at our service here at Gospel Fellowship, one of the things I notice is we do the same thing. We confess very early in the service, and we have something of an absolution or a declaration of forgiveness given from the pastor. Then they would move into some of that French psalm singing, or the Decalogue singing, followed by a prayer of illumination and scripture reading and the preaching of the word. So all of that looks very familiar to our Presbyterian eyes here. After this, though, then the intercessions in the Lord's Prayer. That's a little bit interesting because that's flipped from where we currently have it. I'm not sure when or how we switched that in order, but apparently Calvin's prayer was after the sermon, and probably to lead in as prayer of preparation for the time of the Lord's Supper. And again, didn't do it every single week, but when they did do it, they would lead in with the singing of the Apostles' Creed, so more singing of a non-psalmody there, or a recitation of one of their confessions of faith. Of course, we Protestants, we write lots of strong, robust confessions of faith. Westminster would not be written until the 1640s, but here they had the Genevan Confession and other declarations of good and right Reformed doctrine. The Lord's Supper would consist of the words of institution, again from 1 Corinthians chapter 11 or one of the Gospels, an exhortation or the fencing of the table. Calvin strongly fenced that table. Once he even almost had to risk his life to fence the table. That's an interesting story. And then as the distribution of the elements would take place, they would either sing another song or perhaps somebody would just read scripture, as the case may be, followed up with a prayer or a psalm of thanksgiving, and then finally here the benediction. So that's what it would have looked like in Calvin's Geneva. You have to almost transport yourself in your mind there to a time where there was no power, there was no electric lights, there's no HVAC, there's no air conditioning, there's no screens with the announcements on them, probably not even printed worship bulletins. You would just have to get used to the rhythm and the flow of the worship service. Okay, and then let's switch gears here and look at John Knox, 1550. Now, Knox also had a couple different variations of worship. He moves from a very simple service of just 4 or 5 elements of worship to a little bit more formalized after he comes to study under John Calvin. And Calvin even approves of one of Knox's orders of worship. So we're going to notice a lot of overlap there between Calvin and Knox. I would say, though, and of course the authors Gibson and Ernge kind of stress this as well, that Knox's service did not have the kind of joyful congregational response that Luther's service would have had, and not quite as much singing, though we do see some psalm singing as we see under John Calvin. There's a lot of exhortations, especially as they move from one element to the other to introduce what they're doing in worship, with sort of a lot of kind of pastoral instruction as the service would go. I find it very interesting that Knox almost always included a prayer for the Queen, given how much tension he had with her historically. And he even wrote that book, The Blast to That Monstrous Regiment of Women. By the way, I went to Scotland. They do not think very highly of John Knox anymore, as we do as Reformed, Presbyterian, Protestant theologians. We think Knox is pretty cool. They don't think he's so cool anymore in Scotland. That's kind of an interesting twist of history there. But let's look at his worship services. Again, we're going to notice that it begins with a confession of sin and either a reading or singing of a psalm, prayer of illumination, followed by scripture reading. The sermon comes a bit early in Knoxian worship. I found that interesting. And again, there's a couple different iterations of Knox's worship services. I think a little bit confusing, even in the book, as clear as it is with their charts. I still think it's a little bit confusing how and when they switched things and why they did it differently. But the sermon is usually early on for Knox. Intercession, Lord's Prayer, Apostles' Creed. Here's another singing of the Psalter. And then they would move into their Lord's Supper. They did not do it every single week, following after the pattern of John Calvin. But when they did, words of institution and lots of exhortation from Knox, distribution, scripture reading, finishing up with a singing of a few verses from Psalm 103. And then, as all worship services do, they end with the benediction. Well, I am interested in what you do in your worship services. Some of you are very highly influenced by Reformation worship. Others of you, not so much. And if we're completely honest, you've thrown out a lot of the old, great, wonderful biblical forms of liturgy in place of something more superficial, maybe just kind of what we might call a concert and a TED Talk, a little bit of the praise band and a little bit of the pastor. If that's what you have, tell me why you do what you do. If you're doing something that's very Lutheran looking or Knoxian or Calvinian, I'd also like to know in the comments of this video. Again, don't forget the link to that great book in the description of this video. Thank you so much for checking in. I do love you lots, and we'll talk to you later.